The Exorcist is an iconic horror tale that has not only inspired spin-offs, but inspired people to get involved in spiritual things. Studies have shown that the film not only increased interest in the subject related to demons, deliverance, and spiritual warfare, but it even inspired some to join the ranks of the clergy in order to fight the forces of darkness. This might sound odd, as many Christian ministries who speak about horror films or films in general and the demonic label the films and all related media demonic in themselves. In regards to The Exorcist, even Billy Graham claimed that he read the novel before the movie was released and tore it up and flushed it down the toilet, saying it pandered to man's innate and fascination with the supernatural. It was even rumored that Billy Graham said the celluloid of the movie itself was infused with evil. But what happens when the horrors of Hollywood become the theological substance of the ministries critiquing them? Is it possible that the tales and tropes of motion pictures such as The Conjuring—
What are you guys?
Well, we've been called ghost hunters, paranormal researchers.
But we prefer to be known simply as Ed and Lorraine Warren,
which is based on the deliverance ministries of Lorraine and Ed Warren, reveal a strange interplay where dark fantasy becomes the religious dogma for how to engage and exorcise the demonic. In 2023, a new book by religion professor Joseph Laycock and preservation librarian Eric Harrelson was released by Oxford University Press entitled The Exorcist Effect: Horror, Religion, and Demonic Belief. I am thrilled to have the authors join me in this episode to discuss the many fascinating elements their research has revealed and how it can help us gain a better understanding of our beliefs concerning nefarious forces. Inspired by the book, this episode is simply entitled The Exorcist Effect. I'm Seth Pierce, and welcome to Beast and Bible. So thank you so much, Joe and Eric, for coming on Beast and Bible today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
So excited to get into the book that you've written, but I want to start with just kind of an icebreaker question. What was the scariest movie you saw as a kid that didn't just scare you, but temporarily or permanently changed the way you thought and behaved?
Eric, you got a good one?
It's my answer to that is a little interesting. I don't have a particular movie that sort of scared me and really got me into, the way, sort of changed the way that I thought about things. I mean, I'd have to admit that Poltergeist wasn't any picnic. I saw that at a fairly early age and was fairly in the right span of time to have seen it. The clown doll kind of messes with you. But a lot of my sort of the way that I internalized and the way that I was brought with horror movies is a little more silly. I watched a lot of USA's Up All Night as a kid, and that is a far more camp kind of arrangement than a lot of other horror movies. So that kind of the way that I feel about the medium and kind of allowed me to take a bit more of a step back from it and be less affected by the actual material and kind of approach it from that goofy setting, because so many of those movies were low budget with, interesting effects, and it was much more silly. And of course, edited for content for being on cable. So. Right.
100%. No, I remember my siblings and I sneaking up and watching USA Up All Night, and lots of memories there. Joe, what about you? Anything particular stand out that even if it was temporary had an effect on you?
Yeah, I think for me it was actually Dreamscape from 1984. And I think I must have been about 6 or so when I saw this. Again, flipping channels, right? I mean, this is a phenomenon of the 80s, as you end up watching just snippets of these movies totally out of context. And a lot of people didn't figure out for another 10 or 20 years what they even saw. But in Dreamscape, this psychic is hired to go into the president's brain because somebody is trying to kill him by giving him a nightmare about a nuclear war. And so at 6, I just tune into this scene, and it's the president's nightmare of, Washington, D.C. on fire. Yeah. And you could hear these little children kind of whispering, why did you kill us? Why did you kill us? And then this door opens and these children who have radiation burns sort of pile out of a closet. And so first of all, I had no idea what I was watching, what this scene was. But at 6, I also didn't know what, nuclear war was or what was wrong with this city. So that sat with me for a long time.
Yeah. No, I think the one for me, I can't remember if I shared it on this podcast or not. I always shared it when I taught the monstrous faith and pop culture class at college, but I snuck out late at night and saw a commercial for Tales from the Dark Side, the 80s kind of horror shorts. And it was the closet, or the thing inside the closet. And I just remember seeing seeing a webbed hand reach out from underneath the bed and miss the college kid's ankle, and then the red eyes in the closet. And for years, like I would have to take like a flying leap into my bed to make sure nothing would grab me. And then the closet door had to be shut every night. Would not be able to, that door needed to be closed, and then I could sleep. Yeah.
I mean, fear of closet is a fairly common thing with kids anyway. And now you've got something actually showing you what's in there,
that burned its way into my young imagination. I was probably 6, 7. And I mean, it was inspiration to clean my room and put things away in the closet, so the parents wouldn't open it. So we just left that closed. So, getting into the book, which I really enjoyed, by the way, I found it really interesting, and it was such a great book on many levels. But for me, one of the things I really liked about it was it filled in a lot of gaps, and we'll maybe talk about this later. But I think as we're looking at not just pop culture and media and its effects, but the idea of deliverance ministry and things like that, in my experience, there's a lot of like independent, freelance deliverance ministry people, but like a coherent theological, historical framework is not as readily accessible. So hearing some of the stories, seeing some of the personalities in the book really kind of filled the gaps in for a lot of conversations, I've been a part of, not just in my work as a professor or someone in academia, but even as a local pastor. It was really helpful to kind of get some frameworks and some background and context for it. So I'm curious though, what was the inspiration behind the book? And can you give kind of a brief elevator pitch on why scholars as well as non-scholars should make it a part of their library?
Well, so when I was doing my PhD at Boston University, I wrote a term paper on The Exorcist, which eventually became a journal article. And this book, American Exorcism by Michael Cuneo, talks about this a little bit, right? He says specifically in that book, pop culture is sort of what made exorcism have a comeback at the end of the 20th century. And so I got an idea pretty early on, well, that's true, but it's kind of a two-way street, right? Because pop culture is also claiming to be based on a true story. So I wrote a piece about exorcism for The Conversation, and I got approached by an acquisitions editor from a publisher who shall remain nameless, who said, can you do something on exorcism? Exorcism's kind of hot right now. And I had, I think, 2 other books under contracts already. And so I reached out to Eric for help, because Eric has been involved with film festivals, and he can talk more about his background on that end. And we produced a proposal and we sent it in, and he said, this is insane, right? Movies don't shape people's religious beliefs, right? That's ridiculous. I could never get this published. And I don't think I even answered that email. Then Oxford University Press actually says, well, we would really like to publish this. We went with them, and that's how we got our contract.
Nice. And so Eric, your background as in film, how did that influence your interest in wanting, to do this?
Well, it's a really interesting thing, especially, having an interest in genre film and having experience with a lot of different horror and that type of film. There always has been a backlash from, certain elements, certain more conservative elements in society that claim that there's a correlation between violent behavior and, violent video games or violent movies. And, of course, someone who was raised watching, watched a lot of that stuff. And I never thought that was, I didn't think that was something that was real. Exactly. Like, movies don't shape anybody. But there was between Michael Cuneo, and then also there was a study about the direct effect of rise in belief in Satan as a sort of like a physical, actual entity that spiked after the release of The Exorcist. And approaching it from that angle and thinking about it a little differently, it's like it isn't necessarily an influence on, it doesn't make people, horror movies wouldn't necessarily make somebody a bad person, but they can definitely influence. And, you're ignorant to think that our media can't influence us, to think that the things that we see on screen can't feed our personal belief systems, and especially related to something like religion, because it it can be so intangible for a lot of people. I think that I thought that that presented a really interesting thing to sort of dive into and study. And I was really excited to work with Joe on it.
Yeah, 100%. I know this is an ongoing tension, not just in religious context, but, how do our media affect us? Do they affect us? And then, of course, getting into more, we're having another scholar on later on this season to look at video games and their effects. And constantly, whether it's movies or video games, when we have a tragedy of some kind, we go and we blame, it's the games they played, it's the movies they watched. And then, of course, I think the reaction from people who enjoy pop culture, consuming, is like, no, they don't do anything. And we sort of have these two extremes where either they're the worst things ever or they don't do anything. And somewhere in between, there has to be a more nuanced dialogue about it. So what is, the Exorcist Effect? And can you give us a few brief examples for those who haven't read the book?
Well, sure. So we have a whole chapter kind of explaining a theory about how films affects the way people see the world. And it's not that people can't tell the difference between movies and real life. Obviously they can, right? There's this famous legend where the Lumiere brothers in Paris showed a film of a train and everybody ran screaming out of the cafe. That never happened. People were impressed. They said, that's amazing. That looks exactly like a train, but nobody thought they were going to be killed. They knew it was still a sheet. So and I think that's kind of a self-congratulatory story. Right? We tell ourselves, boy, our ancestors were so dumb with movies, but we're so smart. What movies do is they're models of things that could happen, right? And so when you are trying to understand something that's happening to you, your brain draws on any past information that it has to build a model. And so just forget about horror movies and demons for a second, but how many times have you talked to someone and they said, well, that's just in movies? Right. Mm-hmm. Especially if it's someone with expertise in medicine or any kind of specialized thing. And they'd say, no, that's not how we do it in real life. Right. That's only what you see in the movies. So that's kind of what we mean when we say these things are influencing each other. So in 1949, the Washington Post publishes an article about an exorcism that becomes supposedly the basis of the movie The Exorcist, which comes out in 1973. Everybody sees that movie and thinks, I need an exorcism. I'm possessed. My kid's possessed. My dog's possessed. Yeah. They go to the Catholic Church, just like in the movie, doesn't really do exorcisms. They don't know how. And so there's this huge demand. What fills the demand is people like Ed and Lorraine Warren, right? Who will definitely come and listen to how your cat is possessed by a demon. Figures like Malachi Martin, the disgraced Jesuit who wrote the book Hostage to the Devil. And so then the cycle begins again, right? So the Warrens become the basis of the Conjuring films, which is now, I think, worth something like $2 billion or something like that with the B. Malachi Martin's book Hostage to the Devil also influences the culture, and it shows up in horror movies like The Crucifixion and Deliver Us from Evil, which also both claim to be based on true stories. And then as we were writing this book, part of the sort of response as the Catholic Church adapts to this demand for exorcism is you have this figure, Gabriel Amorth, who founds the International Association for Exorcists. The Exorcist, by the way, was his favorite film. And now he's being portrayed by Russell Crowe in this kind of ridiculous movie called The Pope's Exorcist. So the cycle continues. So The Exorcist Effect, it's a Mobius strip where events and experiences inspire horror movies, and those horror movies in turn inspire more experiences and more events ad infinitum.
Yeah, that's an excellent summary. And then, Eric, from your perspective, where have you seen this at work in your life?
Well, I think, Joe talked a little bit about, Ed and Lorraine Warren, and we felt like that was one of the sort of one of our greatest primary examples of that. However, I think that we sort of found it. One of the reasons why we kind of, and we may touch on this a little bit later too, but one of the reasons why we chose religious-based films is because of the nature of a lot of these is the claiming of based on a true story. And there's Exorcist Effect in films that aren't related to religion as well, though. There was a study done. I may botch some of this information, so, fact check me, y'all. But I think it was, there was a study done about people read a paper that was the description of a historical event. They then watched a movie that depicted this historical event, which, of course, with its Hollywood liberties. And the further then they tested the same group of people and gave them a quiz about the true events, what happened in this historical event. The further, and they tested them, I believe, at 2 weeks, then maybe at a month and on down. The further you got from the initial information, intake, the reading or the viewing, the further you got from that, the more the movie took precedent over what had actually happened. So the more people thought that what had really occurred was what occurred in the movie. Take something, for instance, like Braveheart. There is one of the big famous battle scenes is them, defeating the English on this open field of battle. And he gives his rousing speech with the half blue face. And if I'm not mistaken, again, I'm not a historian, so I may be conflating some things. But if I'm not mistaken, the reason why they won that battle is because it didn't take place in an open field, and they had like a choke point with a bridge, and it was far more complex and different than what we had seen in the film. But because of the way that film creates those models for what we think is possible, sometimes those facts get conflated. And it's especially true, like we said before, especially true when it's, quote unquote, based on a true story, right? But when they tend to say, well, we're taking this is what happened, putting it on screen. It's they never say, there's no big flashing sign that says, well, but not this part. That never happens, so it's just those things tend to influence and replace reality. So I think that's kind of an example of it as well.
No, that's excellent. And it gets into this idea that you mentioned in the book, these idea that we have scripts, right? These films, these pop culture artifacts give us scripts that become the lenses we look through. My background, academically after theology is communication. And one thing I remember looking at when we look at advertising and communication theories, we've got something I'm sure you're familiar with, the heuristics of availability, where it's the most recent thing. And it's like a mental shortcut, right? So if I say shark and someone has watched Jaws, it doesn't matter if they've read, like you said, like a paper on sharks, they saw a documentary. If they saw Jaws, the first image that's come into their head is a big sentient shark that's going to try to kill their family next of kin. And so advertisers, of course, play on this because they know certain images are going to likely play on those mental shortcuts. And so what I hear you saying, connecting it with that idea is when people are consuming film, and even if they don't, because I think you bring this up in the book too, even if they haven't watched the movie, whether they've encountered the trailer for the movie, marketing, advertising for the movie, a conversation about it, that can kind of override a more nuanced historical, theological, religious perspective. It's the shortcut. Oh yeah, my cousin told me about this, or I saw this later. I was on USA Up All Night and I saw this trailer, and that's what this looks like. And that then becomes the script with which we interpret our, whatever's happening in life with. And so, yeah, it's a fascinating concept. And I'm wondering too, and I asked this question, just curious in your studies and researching the book, two theories that came to mind when I was looking at the Exorcist Effect are cultivation theory, which is one that sort of posits, the media don't make you do things. So, you played Halo or Call of Duty, it doesn't make you, violent, but it can cultivate a certain idea about how the world might be. So the classic example when the theory was developed is looking at crime shows, right? If you're sitting there and watching all sorts of CSI and everything else, it might lead you to believe that your neighborhood is more dangerous than it actually is. You might go out and buy a gun to protect yourself because you're nervous and you could accidentally shoot someone or something you didn't mean to, so it didn't make you violent, but it sort of convinced you that maybe the world was a particular way. So do you see the Exorcist Effect as kind of in a similar dialogue saying, the films are not going to necessarily make you a certain way, but they can cultivate a certain perception of how the world works and the spiritual world works, if that makes sense?
I mean, one thing that we noticed is it doesn't seem that people who are actually horror movie fans are very susceptible to this. So if they're watching these movies deliberately and they kind of have put some thought into sort of who the director is and what, which Michael Myers movie is this again, and that sort of thing, they were less likely to be persuaded by it. The person who seemed to be more likely to be influenced by what we're calling the Exorcist Effect are people who were, especially in the 80s, like we were talking about watching this on cable kind of and not really paying attention. And so the idea just sort of creeps into their head almost subliminally. And actually, if you watch the 1989 movie The Burbs, it shows Tom Hanks's character and he's falling asleep and he's switching channels and The Exorcist comes on and then he falls asleep and he has this nightmare where his neighbors are holding a satanic ritual and he's being roasted on a giant, barbecue grill in the backyard. And of course, that's meant to be comedic, but I think it demonstrated a phenomenon that was actually happening a lot in the 80s. So it's not so much the quantity of horror movies, but it has to do with kind of absorbing it with only kind of half of your attention to it.
Yeah. So you mentioned this in your book, A Dangerous Games, and you're talking about, the relationship between people of faith and imagination and almost this, and please correct me if I'm messing this up, but how children, when they're consuming various media, they had an easier time differentiating between, this is a story, this is make-believe, but adults, I think this specifically about Dungeons and Dragons, they were the ones coming at it saying, oh no, you've unlocked a portal to hell or whatever it was, and having trouble with these meta-communicative frames, right? Like I can't distinguish, everything is true in the same way, this is real, and not really being able to recognize, okay, this is coming to me in the form of a film, a comedy, a horror movie, but everything is sort of on an equal playing field in terms of truth. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I mean, one thing J.R.R. Tolkien said is when you tell children a story about a dragon and they ask, is this true? It's not that children don't have any ideas about whether dragons are real or not. What they mean is, what genre of story are you telling me? Right? They don't have the vocabulary to ask that question, but that's what they actually mean, right? What genre of story is this, right? Jeff Zaks is a neuroscientist, and we drew heavily on his book Flicker. And one thing he found there is your brain seems to be wired to preserve facts and information. It's not really wired to remember the source of those facts and information. Yeah. So especially if something strange is happening to you or you're upset or you're scared, your brain's going to throw a bunch of information at you, but it could be from something you heard in church, or it could be from a horror movie, or it could be really anywhere. And you often have no idea where it's actually coming from. You just know it.
Yeah. No, so it kind of gets embedded in the cultural imagination. We just assume this is the way it is. Another theory that came to mind that gets used for a variety of different things is a media agenda setting. And again, the little mantra that goes with it is the media don't tell us what to think, but they tell us what to think about, and even what to think about in relationship with each other. And when I was reading The Exorcist Effect, it really struck me how if someone is consuming, again, whether intentionally or unintentionally, they're it sounds like more often unintentionally and not being aware of the source, it's putting certain ideas together. So as we kind of maybe later talk about some of these ideas that come around with deliverance ministries, these pop culture scripts put certain aesthetics, certain ideas, certain words, certain, whatever together. And so in the mind of somebody who hasn't really deep dived look at this stuff, they think, okay, possession, exorcism, these things, these are the accoutrement of this. And really what they're doing is walking around with movie scripts, movie frames, and it's not necessarily related to historical theology. Is that on the right track? Like, does the Exorcist Effect kind of suggest that, when people are consuming this, there's ideas that are getting put together that may not actually reflect what actually happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part, especially if we're looking at the Satanic Panic, was the role of talk shows, right? And promoting these ideas. And 2020 specifically showed about 2 minutes of Rosemary's Baby and said, real Satanists are exactly like the people at this horror movie, right? That we just showed you. But on the other hand, I think that, it's kind of who is leading who, right? Because the media was putting all that stuff out because that's what people wanted. People were tuning in, right? They were sort of giving you the garbage that you asked for. I think that actually may have changed a bit. We could talk about maybe a little bit later on. QAnon, I think, is actually being weaponized. I think certain figures like Russia or Michael Flynn actually want to pump that stuff out, not just because it's entertaining or gets ratings, but because it actually serves a particular agenda. And the other thing, and maybe Eric can speak more to this than me, is the fairness doctrine and the removal of the fairness doctrine in the 1980s and how that affected the media ecosystem.
Yeah, please. I would love, that's a huge point when I've done media classes. I would love, please speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I have a little bit of reading, a little bit of knowledge about it, but it's the fairness doctrine is the concept that there was, I believe, and I'll butcher the numbers, but networks were required to have neutral news reporting for X amount of hours in a day, and that news reporting could not be embedded in advertising, could not have advertising embedded. It was supposed to be, this is factual, this is news. And with the repeal of the fairness doctrine, and then that led to the rise of, at the same time as the rise of the Fox network, and the blending of news and entertainment. And that some of that leads to those talk shows, that kind of blending of editorializing, but not really having to be as open about your editorialization, and the ability to, then in turn move advertisement during it. That influences, as Joe said, the content you give. If all you care about is eyes on product to sell advertising, then you give the people what they want. You give what draws. And that affects, and especially in an older audience, for, Gen Z and younger kids, they didn't really grow up with that type of news program. But if you consider folks that grew up, before that, the news was a trusted authority. And the necessity for that critical evaluation of that content was not quite as pronounced. Folks tended to generalization, but it tended to be a far more authoritative and actually a far more true medium, as opposed to sensationalizing. The allowing of the sensational nature of it to generate money through advertising, I think, influenced a lot of how information was presented. And we can see, Joe talked, we talk a lot in the book. We talk about sort of, satanic panic stuff and how the media really sort of blew those up. And, circle back to a point, Joe was talking about earlier, some of those folks didn't even watch the movies that they were talking about. They just, this is what it is, and this is bad, and you can't see it because seeing it is, in fact, owning it, being around it is in fact evil. So they didn't even have the chance to watch the piece of media and deliver a critical analysis of it. They just immediately assumed that these were horrible and they were leading to all of these horrible behaviors.
That reminds me, I was talking to a friend this week who's got another podcast, and they were doing an interview, and someone who has a faith-based sort of media critique YouTube channel admits, we don't watch the media we critique. We just do clips. We read like a wiki, they're not even, consuming it. And it's that same idea. And this gets into a different conversation, and we can pivot here maybe a little bit. I don't want to get too off track, but the idea that these types of media are a contagion, right? Like if I read this book or I watched this movie, I'm infected, now. And removing the fairness doctrine where you no longer have to do that unbiased, neutral opinion. People are just free to throw stuff out there, and it gets pretty sensationalist. That resonates a lot with what I see in different faith-based circles, is that sort of mindset is still there. It's interesting to me, even looking at how we do our presidential debates. If you go back to 1960s, 1970s, and you watch a debate, me being kind of I'm still claiming millennial. I'm on the edge. I'm like, what is it? The Oregon Trail generation, right on the edge. But it's fairly boring. It's a couple of guys sitting around a table, and it's pretty quiet. There's no studio audience. And then you look at 2016, 2020, and it's far more entertainment, studio audience. And what's interesting to me is the request, even, and who knows what'll happen, but the next presidential debate wanting the studio audience gone, and not in there. And there's a part of me, as messy as our election season will probably be, is kind of excited not to have that much entertainment pumped to it. Just sit around a table, don't call each other names. Let's just have a talk, about stuff. And so as much as I like entertainment and media, I think we're saturated, and it would be, maybe it's nostalgia, but to get back to something, for those news sources to have a little bit more even-handed approach. But then I know then people cry free speech, and, I should be able to be as extreme as I want. So I don't know. It's a complicated. Joe, you're going to say something?
Yeah, I was interviewed by the Geraldo Rivera show in 2009, and I had lunch with one of his producers, and he said, I did that Satanism special in 1988. And he just said that the ratings were just off the charts. I just killed it with that special. He was so proud. I didn't point blank ask him, you know that none of that was true, and you terrified thousands of people and made them think their kids were being tortured in daycare. Yeah. And I don't think he cared about that. I don't think he cared that, it was some big blow for conservatism or anything like that. I think he just said, my job is to make highly rated shows, and I got great ratings on that. And he was still proud of it 20 years later.
Wow. And this gets into another dynamic, and you alluded to it with some of the characters, that show up in your book, sort of the moralpreneur, these, kind of enterprising, often they're, I don't want to label all evangelists, but many times sort of evangelists, what we would call independent ministries, who notice a cultural moment where people are afraid and panicked, and they slip right in there, and whether it's books or YouTube videos now, whatever, and really freak people out. I think sort of one of the poster children, for it is, I'm going to blank in his name, the psychologist who was involved with Michelle Remembers, years and years later. It didn't matter that it was true to her. It didn't really matter if it was true or not. You sold, how many thousands of books and made a bunch of money. So yeah, who cares? And that's a huge ethical issue, I think, that people have to wrestle with. But yeah, you in the book, there's a few characters. You talk maybe a little bit about some of the religious moralpreneurs who kind of sweep into these moments where people are having this fear of the demonic and sort of capitalize on it.
Yeah, so you have figures, you have so many of them, right? But, at the start of the Satanic Panic, you have figures like Mike Warnke, the Christian comedian who says he started a satanic cult. You have Michelle and Lawrence Pasder, who started out as psychiatrist and patient and then married each other. You have the Warrens, who did sort of talk shows all over America. We mentioned Malachi Martin, who starts off writing these kind of more highbrow intellectual books, and then writes Hostage with the Devil, and then near the end of his life did Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell for about 4 or 5 episodes. So yeah, all these people, of course, Bob Larson of The Exorcist, all these people have a vested interest in kind of keeping this train going because that's literally their livelihood.
Yeah. I'm going to thread a needle here because I'm not, the podcast, I don't want to have a Geraldo Rivera moment myself or a Jerry Springer moment. It's not the purpose. But I am interested. We talked at meetings last year a little bit about Jonathan Ramirez, who is somebody I saw cropping up on social media, especially around Halloween. Would his ministry, based on his involvement with Santeria, warnings against demonic activity in Halloween, his alleged, I died and went to hell and got a message, I've come back to share it. Does he kind of fit within the scope of the Exorcist Effect? Would you consider him to be someone who kind of matches maybe the framework of somebody who's, whether it's a moralpreneur or somebody who is using the Exorcist Effect or something like it to build his platform?
Yeah, so in the interviews that I've seen with Ramirez, I mean, I think he probably really does have a background in Santeria, right? There are people who say, the Santeria devil worshiper, they don't know what they're talking about. He seems to know what he's talking about, right? Okay. When he says things like, I was initiated and my father was Shango and my mother was Yamaya, like these are not things that you would know without some background. However, he's then saying, well, Santeria is Satanism and therefore I was in a satanic cult, right? That is like me saying my high school cross-country team was satanic and therefore I was initiated into a satanic cult, right? And tortured by it. It's a kind of a sleight of hand, right, with how you categorize stuff. So even though he may have some actual knowledge of Santeria, I think that he is appealing to a sort of Hollywood version of demonized Santeria. And one of the most sort of well-known examples of what we're talking about is the movie The Believers from 1987 with Martin Sheen. And this is nominally about Santeria, but by the end of the movie, it's clear that all this stuff about being a misunderstood religion from Cuba, that's all BS. And actually they sacrifice people, right? And then in 1989, the Spring Breaker from UT Austin was murdered in Matamoros, Mexico by Adolfo Constanzo. And at the time, everybody said, we told you there were satanic cults that were murdering people. And then it turned out Adolfo Constanzo was obsessed with the movie The Believers. Right. So he was literally copying this fake Hollywood version of Santeria as this satanic evil religion. The other thing that we found, which was really interesting, is we're looking for sort of movie depictions of the Black Mass. And one of the oldest depictions that we found was this film called Mondo Freudo. And the Mondo movies were fake documentaries, usually just an excuse to show a bunch of sex and violence. And they would have this dry British voiceover. Right. And so he would say, and what you're about to see now is a satanic mass performed by Puerto Ricans living in Manhattan. And then it's like, they get just some local dancer from the strip club and she just does a routine and there's like a skull and some blood. They said, and after this, she was sacrificed to the devil. Right. Yeah. But what's interesting about it is this came out in 1966. The Church of Satan is like just getting started. Right. But they must have made a decision to say, people won't believe this is real if we show white suburbanites doing this. But if we show Puerto Ricans in Manhattan doing this, they'll believe it. Right? Yeah. So there's a kind of this idea of, Satanism can be found amongst these, Caribbean, brown-skinned people. And I think that regardless of, the details of Ramirez's actual life, I think the people who are promoting him and liking this stuff on social media have been saturated in this rather racist Hollywood depiction of Afro-Caribbean religion as satanic.
Wow. And we see that, that sort of depiction of, Afro-Caribbean culture as almost as related to Satanism through music. In the book, we do a chapter on heavy metal because heavy metal was a big target. Yeah. And there were a lot of, we had, the Seal of Satan murder where, I'm sorry, Joe, help out. What was his name? Ricky Queso? Ricky Queso was... Yeah. Say you love Satan. He was, a troubled youth drug dealer, killed a guy over stealing drugs, but apparently he said, say you love Satan to him. And that was, a component of a lot of different films that ended up kind of following in that tradition. But even long before the 1980s, Bob Larson and numerous other different preachers wrote books outlining the satanic nature of rock and roll and as it relates to African music, African and Afro-Caribbean music that, and he did one of the books of his that I read dealt with it was called Hippies, Hindus and Rock and Roll. And it was about the Beatles going to India and bringing back Satanism and demons with their music. Yeah. And there was a lot of different other authors that sort of, religious authors that piled onto that and showed that, rock and roll is drum beats and all this stuff. And it's from Africa. And that's all that is all Satanism stuff. So even just non-religious practice of the culture was viewed by a lot of people as being connected, at least tangentially connected to this, perceived idea of satanic worship in their religious culture as well.
Yeah, and in this mindset, Hindus in India and indigenous religions in Africa are the same people, right? Even though they're on different continents. But this is a mindset in which it's all scary, brown heathenry. And it's all sort of infiltrating our society through rock music.
This reminds me of another debate I heard even between people who would identify more as Pentecostal, charismatic, and people who are not, of those traditions. And I've watched people try to trace, the modern glossolalia, speaking in tongues, to, these voodoo, in quotes, voodoo practices from, the slaves that were brought from Haiti or West Africa or West India, all this kind of stuff. And so it's the same kind of thing, right? It's this, if I can use this, this, it's just racially coded, everywhere. Later in the season, we're going to talk about, zombies and voodoo and things like that. And even some of the tendency, I mean, this will come up. It's almost a cliche now, but, Pat Robertson blaming an earthquake, was it 2010, on Haiti because of the voodoo, it's just almost a trope, a script that keeps replaying and then gets reinforced, in media. Correct me if I'm wrong. And this would have been a USA Up All Night special too. I think it was Predator 2, kind of, I think had some imagery along the same lines too, where there was some link between Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean, indigenous religion and monstrous aliens. So it's always framed as something scary and other. It's never positive. So what other areas and ministries, as you're looking around the current Christian landscape, are sort of ripe for analysis? Using your framework, you've established the framework in the book. And if another scholar wanted to come along and kind of use it and apply the Exorcist Effect, where are you seeing possible fruitful areas of inquiry?
Well, church attendance is declining, and it seems like what we're getting is this new kind of landscape of internet media, right? Where everyone is duking it out on TikTok and YouTube for eyeballs, and they're looking for kind of new stuff. And the result is that kind of religion and horror and conspiracy theories, it all just seems to be merging together, right? So right now I'm doing this work on reptilians, on people who think that, secret lizard people run the country. And a big figure in this was this woman named Sherry Schreiner, who was considered to be and she called herself a prophet, and she wrote books about, Bible codes and things like that. And you can see a lot of this stuff in there. So she's saying that, aliens are attacking us and aliens are satanic and they're prophesied in the Bible. And then she's saying, if you don't believe me, the government makes movies about aliens to prepare us for disclosure, right? So this is this conspiracy theory that when E came out, we had an alliance with the aliens and they wanted to show aliens being nice, but then relations with the aliens kind of soured, so then they made Independence Day. Right? Yeah. But it's basically using fictional movies as a way of sort of knowing what's actually going on.
Like Men in Black and the tabloids, right? Like if you read the National Enquirer, that's really telling you what's going on. Yeah.
Exactly, right. And this used to be kind of very sort of niche UFO stuff, but with figures like Sherry Schreiner, we can see it's beginning to get merged with deliverance ministry and with Christian prophecy and stuff like that. So I think we're going to see much weirder stuff going forward. I think the stuff we talk about, the Exorcist Effect, will seem tame by comparison, unfortunately.
That's like exciting for research, but not for like living in it. Yeah. So, along those lines, you kind of mentioned, aliens, lizard people, gets into, kind of QAnon, all this other stuff. What are sort of three elements, that find currency among believers that you see originate in horror films and not necessarily sacred texts or early Christian writing? So I think one of them, and I can't remember, I'd have to go back and look, but there was one where like the VHS tape itself, just having it in your house, meant it was, like this object is infused, and you hear that, in Christian writings, not just recently, but, decades old. If you have this object in your house, and in, if I'm remembering, I'm thinking hard, correct me if I'm wrong, but remembering from the text, that's demonstrably from, I don't know if it was Rosemary's Baby, I don't know if it was The Omen, it's a horror movie, piece. It's not actually something from like Thomas Aquinas or Augustine, or scripture. So can you talk a little bit about what are some very, maybe two or three things that people have picked up and run with it as though it's like, Bible truth, and it's actually from a horror movie?
Yeah. So, I think what you're referring to is Billy Graham said that the Exorcist, there was evil in the very celluloid of the film. And then we found a contemporary deliverance minister who said you have to actually treat horror movie DVDs in your house as if they are demons. And you have to not just get rid of them, but actually like banish them, right? Like be gone, Pumpkinhead, be gone, Sleepaway Camp, right? And so forth. So we have a chapter about what we call the Unholy Trilogy, which is Rosemary's Baby, 1968, The Exorcist, 1973, The Omen, 1976. And those three movies are often compared as sort of the beginning of this genre of supernatural horror. So Rosemary's Baby, you get the idea that the Antichrist will be the son of the devil, right? Which was really not an idea in Christianity, right? But prior to that, The Exorcist, you get this obsession with Ouija boards, right? The Catholic Church had said we don't really approve of Ouija boards when they first came out. But prior to this, Ouija boards were seen as like the hula hoop or something, right? It was like this sort of dorky pastime for kids, which is why it was sold by like Parker Brothers. After this, now Ouija boards are scary and dangerous, which actually makes them cool again. People finally have a reason to play with Ouija boards. And then in The Omen, you have these kind of bizarre notions about the number 666, right? Because although that movie was sort of conceived by an evangelical producer, he tapped David Seltzer, who was a secular Jew, to write it. And he read the book of Revelation and said, gosh, this is really dumb, and even made up fake verses from Revelation that appear in the film. And so, of course, in the film, the child actually has a birthmark shaped like the numbers 666 on the back of his head. And, prior to this, there had been speculation about what does 666 mean in Revelation, but figures like Irenaeus understood, well, it's a numerical code. We have to find something that adds up to those numbers. But now it's the numbers themselves are evil. And so we have people saying like, well, Monster Energy drink has these 3 claw marks on the front, and that's actually a sixes. So Bible scholars like Steve Wiggins have said nobody really thought about this one passage from Revelation that way before the movie The Omen.
Yeah, that reminds me. I mean, I joked about this last season. We did an episode on the Mark of the Beast with John Pauline from Loma Linda University. And, you probably have them too, but like being at the grocery store and buying, 2 Chobani yogurts, a banana, and granola, and the total is like $16.66 or $6.66. And I've had like the cashier, do you want to buy something else? Do you want to do you want to add like a piece of, like, no, I'm fine. Like, it's fine. Nothing is going to happen here. But yeah, just being spooked by the number itself. Yeah, is out there.
Yeah, I mean, we had a chemistry teacher in high school, and we were doing chemistry equations, and something came out to, 0.666 repeating, and he wouldn't let someone write that on the board, right? And he's the chemistry teacher.
That's a very common measurement to occur. Geez.
Yeah.
But I think that for most of the history of Christianity, that would be seen as a totally ridiculous reaction, right? Is that the Christians ought to just be able to do chemistry equations, right? So I don't think that's something that could have really happened before The Omen.
Yeah. So one of the most interesting books or most interesting elements of the book for me, and something I want to do continued study on, and it was really helpful to get a language to this, is the concept of ostension, which you take from folklore studies. Can you briefly describe, what is ostension and how people might see each of the 4 stages that you discuss play out in a religious context?
Okay, so folklorists used to assume that folkloric stories are based on some sort of true event, right? And sometimes that's true, but what they found more often was that it's the opposite, that events are actually based on urban legends and folklore. And movies are kind of a big emerging field in this area of research. So what's often cited as a classic example of ostension is what I already talked about with the movie The Believers. And then Adolfo Constanzo, who had an apprentice. He had this girl who was learning to be basically an evil Santeria practitioner from him. And he said, well, first thing you got to do is watch The Believers over and over again. Right? And then we're going to go do a human sacrifice, just like in The Believers. So that was full ostension. The story literally came to life. Somebody was literally killed as a result of that. And then Bill Ellis has said, well, there are other things that are kind of ostension adjacent, but it's not full ostension. So he talks about quasi-ostension, which is that you interpret phenomena in light of legends that you've heard or movies that you've seen. So, I mean, this has happened to all of us. If you hear like a strange noise in the middle of the night and you start thinking about what could that be, that could be quasi-ostension. An example that I use sometimes, I've been approached twice about alleged cattle mutilations. Right. And it's vultures. It's always vultures, right? But people have heard stories about either aliens or satanic cults, and that becomes the framework through which they interpret this dead cow. So that would be quasi-ostension. Proto-ostension is someone creates a narrative based on a legend. Bill Ellis's term is charitable, creates a narrative. A less charitable word would be lying. But so Michelle Smith and Michelle Remembers seems to have made up the story of satanic ritual abuse. And you can tell she's drawing directly on horror movies, right? Like literally she says, oh, there's this weird lady, her head's spinning around in a circle and it looks really strange, right? Well, gosh, where could she have gotten that image in her head? And then finally, there is pseudo-ostension, and pseudo-ostension is a hoax to spread a legend. So you are sort of doing something to see if you can make other people believe in this legend. So an example of this would be in 2017 when they made the new It movie. There were reports of clown attacks all over America. We even had one at Texas State where the police had to come out to a student apartment. And so that would be pseudo-ostension. These people know that this is all imaginary, but it's a fun thing to do. And people have done hoaxes like this all the time. So yeah, those would be the kind of different varieties of ostension and ostension adjacent activities.
Super helpful. Excited to play with that concept more. So looking at the very real social consequences of people getting swept up in the Exorcist Effect, what makes people susceptible to the Exorcist Effect, and what can people do to help others caught up in it? So like the practical question, if you see somebody kind of getting caught up in this, first of all, what makes people susceptible? Or what kinds of things? And then how do you talk to friend, family member, colleague? You're like, I think you're going off the deep end here.
Well, Eric, you've got the degree in library science, and you frame this as an information literacy problem. So maybe
sort of considering the concept of information literacy and, of course, critical information literacy. In library science, we discuss, especially now because of the widespread nature of the internet and how there is very little fact check in any way, shape, or form on anything that comes out of the internet. A lot of it is all down to the reader and to the people consuming to critically evaluate what they see and what they read and what they're exposed to. And I think that is something that if you were seeing someone who is starting to sort of slide through some of these stages and experiencing some of this and starting to, maybe falter a little, kind of going through some of that critical information literacy protocol, just first and foremost, like consider the source. Who is telling you this? And could there be a secondary motivation for that? Do your fact checking. See if that case that they talked about where this, horrible thing happened in this elementary school to all these children. See if that. Another trick another like sort of interesting question that interesting way that I like to propose it, especially in, maybe not necessarily involved with, our kind of religious sort of narrow interpretation of the Exorcist Effect, but sort of dipping into the more conspiracy minded stuff too. Something that is interesting to say is like, how many people does this affect? How many people would have to know about it? And how many people would have to lie about it to keep it a sort of clandestine secret? How massive is this conspiracy? And the larger that it is required to still maintain that secrecy, the less likely it is that everybody involved could keep their mouths shut and keep from, espousing that. But it really does start with the ability to understand and to personally make those choices when you're talking, when you're reading through anything, any kind of factual information, to say to yourself, especially another trick is like, is it an emotional piece of content? Does it touch you in an emotional or spiritual way? Yeah. Very important to take some time with it and maybe don't dive headfirst in just because it grabs something inside of you that makes you horrified or makes you, touches it such a visceral emotion. It's challenging because not only do we have a very free exchange of information via the internet, we also have, if you couple it with a spiritual and religious aspect, it's easy to start buying into these kind of things, especially if it's coming from an authority in, let's say, for example, a religious authority, a deliverance preacher or someone like that. They are a trusted member of your community as a person in that particular faith. But it really does come down to just you as an individual evaluating what you're being told and not reacting quickly on that visceral feeling, right?
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. And I think that's the challenge with everything being so quick and reactionary. Our whole media ecology is speed, reaction, rage baiting, all those kind of things. So just people slow down and ask some of those critical questions. It's huge. It's a huge challenge, but it's critical. This maybe pivot a little bit, and then we'll kind of ask one more question to wrap up. And this is kind of born out of my own, context where, issues of deliverance, possession, exorcism are very different in the global South versus the West. And one of the debates that we've experienced in my own tradition as an Adventist is the West really has no discussion going on about it, about deliverance ministries, anything like that. Whereas our churches in the global South are saying, hey, this is a very real phenomenon we experience. Can you say something? And there's a big tension, theologically between the West and the global South. So kind of two questions, I guess, in terms of the Exorcist Effect, is this something that is more a Western phenomenon, or do we see it globally? And then the other question that maybe deviates a little bit is, what sort of cultural tensions do you see between how the West and maybe the global South approaches ideas of deliverance and exorcism?
Yeah, so I assume that this is going on in the global South, but that is an assumption because I don't have the data and the language skills to study it the way that I can study my own culture. We talk a little bit in the book about, there are entirely different horror industries in places like Japan and Thailand and Korea and Turkey, and they're dealing with the kind of folklore and religious traditions of those cultures, and a lot more work needs to be done on that. David Frankfurter's book, Evil Incarnate, talks about in Ghana, there's this whole genre of witchcraft movies in Ghana, right? Which are horror movies, but I think also directly fueled kind of actual witch hunting, right? Yeah. In Ghana, you hear stories about, missionaries who go to Africa, and the local congregation says, okay, well, we're glad you're here. Get started on the exorcisms. Right. And they're like, what do you mean? They were like, well, then why are you here? You're here to do exorcisms. Get cracking.
Right. Yeah.
So there is that kind of disconnect that you mentioned. On the other hand, I think that Westerners who are sort of preoccupied with demonology tend to become missionaries, right, and are partly responsible for the preoccupation with the demonic in the global South. And so I think between sort of more conservative deliverance ministers here in the West and then in the global South, I see it more as this back and forth of a kind of yes and game. And I'll give you an example of that. Bob Larson released this video about the show Squid Games. Right. Squid Games got very popular, and so he's got to kind of piggyback on it. Has nothing to do with demons. It's set in Korea. But he says, well, the squid demon is closely related to the octopus demon. And these are marine demons that I fight all the time. And I'm saying, what the hell is a marine demon? Yeah. Right? Well, as best I could tell, the idea of a marine demon comes out of Nigeria, where you have these local traditions about goddesses like Mamiwata, who traditionally were thought to live in coasts or rivers or things like that. And there's just kind of these legends about you could pray to Mamiwata, but there would usually be kind of strings attached. And the missionary said, well, Mamiwata is a demon. And then eventually this emerged this idea of, well, it's marine demons. It's its own kind of category of demon. So Bob Larson is this American deliverance minister using a Nigerian demonology to deconstruct a Korean television show. Yeah. So it really is a global phenomenon. And it's all very creative and performative. They want you to believe that this is all kind of based on these ancient texts and traditions. It's not. This is often, these are things that have only been around for 10 years or so. Yeah. And that gets into a whole other area. I mean, I think we chatted a little bit before about the book Pigs in the Parlor, which is sort of at one time was the handbook for deliverance ministries. And apparently you said there's an autographed copy at Texas State. Is that right somewhere? I don't know why, but we have a copy signed by Ida May and Frank Hammond at Texas State. And that book, and it's made in the 70s, but allegedly sold millions. It's this, it really, I think, has had, whether it's people know it or not, they've maybe been affected by it when they get into this area. But in that book, there's chapters with whole taxonomies, like literally everything is a demon. You have a demon of mold in your jar of peanut butter, rebuke it, and this obsession with sort of everything's a spirit, everything's a demon. And then you have people like Bob Larson who just, again, latching on to Squid Games because it's popular and sort of retrofitting this demonology on it, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If you're familiar with, it's more of a movie. It has nothing to do with anything along those lines. So we get carried away or people get carried away and then they buy into it and then just, of course, share the videos and whatever. So it's definitely still out there. And I appreciate you bringing up that dynamic because I think it's an excellent window into how these things kind of get in a loop and end up being, destructive. Mentioning the very real witch hunts going on in Ghana or Tanzania and other places, there are real consequences to this kind of behavior, where real people get hurt. So definitely critical to study. And the book is incredibly useful, and helpful for those things and more. You were talking about real world consequences. That's one of the things that we really wanted to try and illustrate in our book. And one of the things that we talk about, one of the primary examples, or one of what I think is one of the primary examples, is the trial of the West Memphis Three with the expert Dale W. Griffiths, who who came on as a Satanism expert and ostensibly got 3 innocent teenagers convicted of horrific murders and were sentenced to nearly 20 years in prison. They're still fighting for their true acquittal. And they were released under a particular plea, and I can't remember the name of it, but Alpha thank you. And it required them to, they would be released from prison, but they wouldn't actually be considered not guilty. The state no longer wouldn't bear any responsibility for it. And that is to me such a prime example of the idea of these evil entities being out there and everywhere,
this concept that the media turns people evil, because the reason why they got these kids is because they wore black and liked metal and were teenage cop kids, you know?
Right.
But the reflection of that is the people who were consuming the media didn't do anything. They weren't affected by it in a violent way, and it didn't make them into violent killers. What it did is make the adults around them very afraid of anything that was in a marginally different media, a marginally different little cultural mindset. And we had Dale Griffiths, as I said before, a police expert, quote unquote expert on it. There's F files that show satanic graffiti, which is like KISS logos and stuff to that effect. So there really is, to touch on something we touched on before, that this idea that the folks who are not really even consuming the media, but consuming the concept of the media or parts of the media, are then weaponizing those parts and saying that this is an evil thing and it's doing these bad things to people when they don't even experience it and aren't really experts in it themselves.
Yeah. And that's the real horror story and irony. And, in terms of monstrous behavior, is we have this perceived threat, we panic, we get fearful, and, we have this reaction that basically, is this monstrous, often violent, traumatic, reaction, and we hurt people. And that's the real thing that happened. Whereas, somebody who played a board game, watched a movie, even though we have different opinions on media and tastes and whatnot, but to send innocent people to jail, to ruin someone's livelihood, to traumatize people. I mean, this is awful, and far worse, than, again, we keep coming back to the staying up and watching, I snuck USA up all night, is far less damaging. And again, that's an endorsement of, let everybody watch whatever and that media don't have an effect on you. But that is so minimal, compared to actually sending innocent people to jail and ruining, a large part of, or maybe, most of their life with this sort of reactionary behavior. Yeah. And that goes back to your point, Eric, about the importance of media literacy, critical thinking, and just slowing down and checking your sources before you do something that's far more horrific than what you think is happening. One question before we go: are there any strange stories, either in the process of writing the book or on the editing room floor, you just couldn't get it in there, things that didn't make it into the book that you could share?
Well, I mean, Eric and I went to the Ed and Lorraine Warren Paracon at the Mohegan Sun Casino, and our chapter on the Warrens was already pretty long, and due to the tone of this book with Oxford University Press, we didn't really want to get into just how dumb some of the artifacts were that were being displayed in this casino. But there was they had this big leather tome, and the card said that this was the Necromonicon. Oh. And I think they meant Necronomicon, right? Yeah. But it sounds like, a product for hair loss or something like that. They had, I think it was Hannah Craddock or something like this, with some local witch from Connecticut. And they just had, a spirit Halloween green-faced witch with just literally a name tag that says, "Hello, I am Hannah Craddock." It was quite a trip. I don't know, Eric, do you remember anything else about the Paracon?
The Paracon was a really interesting thing because it was, well, first of all, it was Tony Spera, who is the son-in-law Ed and Lorraine Warren, but has sort of come into carrying on their tradition. He came into he owns, I don't know if he runs NESPR, the New England Society for Paranormal Research or Psychical Research, or however they describe it. And he's kind of carried on their tradition. And something that struck me so much about the Paracon was just how much it resembled any horror movie convention I'd ever been to. Just booths of vendors. And they had this sort of really disappointing, as Joe said, these really disappointing quote unquote artifacts, because that was a big part of Ed and Lorraine's shtick, was they had a museum full of all the haunted and possessed artifacts that they had come across in their travels. So these were proudly displayed for us in the casino conference room at the Mohegan Sun. But it was so disappointing and so crassly commercial. Just there it cost $50 to get in there and look at a mannequin with a costume on it that said Hannah Crank. Like, great, that's a witch. Sure, if you want. Yeah. Like there was, what was one of the other artifacts, the satanic ritual sword. That was very clearly just a fantasy sword that they bought somewhere. Bought
at the mall or something. Yeah.
On Wish. Yeah.
Yeah. So you gotta almost make I can't remember the song, but it's like some of those TikTok or Reel videos when they go to the local amusement park and it's really chintzy and cheap and they play that recorder version of the Jurassic Park theme or whatever. And it's just, terribly unsatisfying, but people are making a quick
And
buck.
you know what? I don't know what I was expecting. I genuinely don't know what I was expecting from it, but it really did feel it was just kind of modeled after any horror convention I'd ever been to. A floor full of vendors. You could line up to meet Arnie Johnson, who was convicted of murder of his boss, but this was the time that Ed and Lorraine Warren had attempted to introduce the concept of demon possession into court. They were going to say that he was possessed by demons and that caused him to hurt his boss. You could line to meet him for an autograph.
That gets into a whole other issue and maybe another podcast of just and this, also brushes up against Jason Bivens, religion of fear when he talks about like the hell houses and things like just the meshing of what he would call the erotics of fear, evangelicalism, and just capitalism, just making money. And we have this is going to be incredibly, but circus sideshows, that sort of have a spiritual veneer on them. And so it's almost like, okay, it's safe for me to go and do this because it's quote unquote Christian or spiritual or whatever. And it's really all designed to make money off of people's fear, paranoia, and fascination. I mean, you mentioned Bob Larson. I don't know if he was doing this before, but I know I know he does it now. But in the pandemic, what is he doing? Like, I think he does an exorcist over Zoom for like $300 and he wears a priest collar, even though he's not Catholic. I mean, it feels gross when you consider there might be very real people who are suffering and have existential questions and they're being manipulated, and taken advantage of. And again, that's why a book like this is so important. And I appreciate you guys so much producing it to raise awareness, give some people some critical thinking tools, some history, some case studies, so we can not be as prone to monstrous behavior and creating situations with very harmful real world consequences. If our listeners want to get connected with you and your work, what are the best ways they can reach out?
For me, just type in Joseph Laycock. I got a pretty rare last name, so you'll find my Google site right away. I'm also on Twitter, and I've got a page on Amazon.
Eric, what about you?
A Google search of my name will likely get you an older mathematician by the same name. Okay. That's not me. I am the preservation and conservation librarian at the University of Miami in Oxford, Ohio. And you can find me.
Okay.
You can find me through the Miami Library's webpage, and you can send me an email if you'd like to talk further about any of this.
Awesome, and we'll try to put some of that too in the show notes for people. But thank you both for coming on the podcast. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks for having us. We enjoyed the conversation.
In a recent book review of The Exorcist Effect on Spectrum Magazine's website, Andre Cannicero shares a personal insight into how the book affected him. He writes, quote, "As a lifelong Brazilian evangelical, this book was very frightening for me, not because of its demonic horrors, but due to the onslaught of realizations that what I was taught to fear by my pastors and elders did not originate in the Bible, but in horror movies. Even though learning that their absolute truths are, in fact, man-made by money-hungry leaders and institutions is, of course, an unusual and critical growing pain for Christians, I did not expect it all to be so painfully explicit and obvious." End quote. There are numerous spiritual casualties when enterprising moralpreneurs, often in the guise of an evangelist, are permitted to scare the hell out of people in order to put them in the pews. To my colleagues in ministry tempted by that approach, I would remind you that you are called to be agents of good news, not tabloid news, and the communities you build using scare tactics tend to consume themselves with toxicity. It may build your platform, but it's not worth your soul. Church administrators often turn a blind eye to fear-mongering tactics and bad theology because it puts butts in seats and money in the church coffers. If you are one of those administrators, this is your call to do better. Uphold evangelistic and theological ethics and dissuade your charismatic communicators from sensationalist narratives that ultimately hurt people and hurt the cause of Christ. Using fear and sensationalism may bring people to church along with their monetary offerings, but the cost in mental health and eventually disillusionment is a greater burden to bear. Finally, I'm reminded of an incident years ago when a conservative conference in my denomination accidentally advertised a marriage seminar with an image of Bella and Edward from the Twilight movie. The hilarity and panic that ensued traumatized those earnest folks who operated in good faith but accidentally used vampires to advertise, and I quote, "a love for a lifetime," end quote. While the posters and ads were corrected, there was a lot of embarrassment. There's a tendency for Christian ministries to critique pop culture in a way that leads to ignorance of it. While this ignorance can make for a funny vampire marriage seminar poster, it is less funny when deliverance ministries and evangelists absorb horror tropes and pawn them off as biblical theology, creating fearful effects in the lives of their followers. In our next episode, we will pivot away slightly from moral panic, but continue to talk about a monster from a faith tradition that is often deployed in times of distress to explain human suffering. Thank you for listening to Beast and Bible. I hope you'll join us again next time.
Beast and Bible is written, researched, produced, and hosted by Dr. Seth Pierce. Ethan Geck is our editor. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Equipment and tech help from the dynamic duo James Gigante and Stephen Husett. Producing and project help from me, Heather Moore. Thanks for listening to Beast and Bible. Tell your friends about us, and don't forget to leave a nightlight on after dark.